enthusiasm somewhere in the society. These ministers were neither built nor filled by atheists. He continues, the spirit that dwelleth in this church has glided away to animate other activities, and they who come to the old shrines find apes and players resulting the old garments. Apes and players wrestling the old garments. In other words, the religion of England is part of good breeding, he will say, but it's not really believed as it once was. This is, of course, an interesting aside for the irreverent, sometimes irreverent Emerson. He says it this way, the doctrine of the Old Testament is the religion of England. The first leaf of the New Testament it does not open. It believes in a providence which does not treat with levity a pound sterling. They are neither transcendentalists nor Christians. They put up no Socratic prayer, much less any saintly prayer for the Queen's mind. Ask neither for light nor right, but say bluntly, quote, grant her in health and wealth long to live, end quote. He continues this idea by saying it this way, but you must pay for conformity, as he's going to talk about the English conforming to their Anglican theology. All goes well as long as you run with conformists, but you who are honest man in other particulars know that there is alive somewhere a man whose honesty reaches to this point also, that he shall not kneel to false gods, and on the day when you meet him, you sink into the class of counterfeits. Besides, this succumbing has grave penalties. If you take in a lie, you must take in all that belongs to it. England accepts this ornamented national church, and it glazes the eyes. We think of Marx and his opiate of the masses, bloats the flesh, gives the voice a stertorous clang, and clouds the understanding of the receivers. In some ways, this may be Emerson's harshest critique. He says the church at this moment is much to be pitied. And by church here, he means the Anglican Church of England. She has nothing left but possession. And then he finally asks, where dwells the religion? Tell me first where dwells electricity or motion or thought or gesture. They do not dwell or stay at all. Electricity cannot be made fast, mortared up, and ended. In other words, this notion of why religion is important within a culture changes with the times. And certainly, of course, Emerson, as we've seen in other lectures, was very much attuned to this. Well, it won't shock us that he's going to give a chapter to literature. This is chapter 14, and he begins by saying it this way. The English muse loves the farmyard, the lane, and the market. In other words, so much of great English poetry, he says, comes from an appreciation of the common person. We think about that link between Emerson's respect of Wordsworth and the burgeoning soon-to-be Walt Whitman in 1855, his Leaves of Grass, and of course, Song of Myself. He says it this way, the union of Saxon precision and Oriental soaring, of which Shakespeare is the perfect example, is shared in less degree by the writers of 2 centuries. He will, it will not shock us, argue that Shakespeare is the most important. The influence of Plato tinges the British genius. Their minds loved allegory, were cognizant of resemblances. We think of our learning theory connecting new to old, and climbers on the staircase of unity. He continues by saying it this way, that Platonic is the poetic tendency, the so-called scientific is the negative and poisonous. This will be Emerson's critique against dead science. 'Tis quite certain that Spencer, Burns, Byron, and Wordsworth will be Platonists, and that the dull men will be Lockists after John Locke. In other words, epistemology. Then politics and commerce will absorb from the educated class men of talents without genius, precisely because such have no resistance. And this is kind of, leads him then to finally talk about Shakespeare and Milton as the 2 supreme writers. And the idea then that if you're going to learn English literature, you have to study your Milton and your Shakespeare. Of course, we did Milton in the Harvest Classics. We'll be talking Shakespeare later. He says it this way, it is the surest sign of national decay when the Brahmins can no longer read or understand the Brahmical philosophy. In other words, as things move on. In other words, he's going to make this argument that was already starting to happen in Emerson's day, apparently, that there was a certain kind of distrust of Shakespeare and Milton and beginning to look past those two greats. And for Emerson, sounding very conservative in this regard, he's going to argue there's something kind of wrong with this whole approach, right? He'll continue in the literature chapter with this. Thus, he says, poetry is degraded and made ornamental. Pope in his school wrote poetry fit to put round frosted cake. So his critique of Alexander Pope is that he's not the poet at all that Milton was. And then he finishes this chapter by talking about Wordsworth. The exceptional fact of the period is the genius of Wordsworth. He had no master but nature and solitude. His voice is the voice of sanity in a worldly and ambitious age. More particularly, he says it that Wordsworth understands that there's something wrong with this industrial revolution that's coming. We think of the world as too much with us late and soon, obviously, right? His next chapter, chapter 15, is the Times. He says it is about the press. The power of the newspaper is familiar in America and in accordance with our political system. In England, it stands in antagonism with the feudal institutions and is all the more beneficent succor against the secretive tendencies of a monarchy. He continues, the tendency in England towards social and political institutions like those of America is inevitable, and the ability of its journals is the driving force. In other words, he'll make the argument that you have to have a free press to be able to have any kind of country that would at all resemble England. The most conspicuous, he says, the most conspicuous result of this talent is the Times newspaper. No power in England is more felt, more feared, or more obeyed. His 16th chapter is a fascinating one. It's one on Stonehenge. And he makes some interesting observations about Stonehenge. He says, as I return to Massachusetts, I shall lapse at once into the feeling which the geography of America inevitably inspires, that we play the game with immense advantage, that there, and not here, is the seat and center of the British race, and that no skill or activity can long compete with the prodigious natural advantages of that country in the hands of the same race, and that England, an old and exhausted island, must one day be contented, like other parents, to be strong only in her children. This is an interesting line. Using Stonehenge as his launching point, Emerson is ready to say, I think it's very possible that England, the mother country, will have to turn around and admit that her children have far outgrown her in almost every way. This, of course, is, many have argued, has been proved out over time. But he asks the question, how came these stones of Stonehenge here? And then he's ready to ask, we wonder how Stonehenge was built and forgotten. By paragraph 17, a paragraph that he will call personal, he's going to begin to make some kind of personal observations and reflections. And he's talking about Wordsworth, and these are some lines that I really enjoy. He says, we found Mr. Wordsworth, when they met him, asleep on the sofa. He was at first silent and indisposed as an old man suddenly waked before he had ended his nap, but soon became full of talk on the French news. And he was nationally bitter on the French, bitter on Scotsmen too. No Scotsman, he said, can write English, which obviously makes us wonder about Burns, right? And the volume of Harvard Classics, number 6, is all Burns. So it's a fascinating way to kind of think about it. He finishes this one talking about Wordsworth. There's a fun story about a gentleman in London, he said, showed me a watch that once belonged to Milton, whose initials are engraved on his face. He said he once showed this watch to Wordsworth, who took it in one hand, then drew out his own watch and held it up with the other before the company. But no one making the expected remark, he put back his own in silence. And it's kind of fascinating that Wordsworth then felt like he somehow should be able to compete with Milton, although Emerson does say that the ode on immortality is the high watermark which the intellect has reached in his age. The child is father of the man. New means were employed, new realms added to the empire of the muse by his courage. I love that when he's talking about Wordsworth, he speaks about courage, right? And then chapter 18, result is what he calls this. He's ready to kind of finish his summation of English culture, English study. He says, England is the best of actual nations. It's no ideal framework. It is an old pile built in different ages with repairs, additions, and makeshifts. But you see the poor best you have got. In other words, London, he says, is the epitome of our times and the Rome of today. And then he makes this observation: some public regards they have. England, they have abolished slavery. He comes back to it one more time to point out how important it is that England is a country that does not have slavery. Obviously, America still does. He says it this way: there is a cramped limitation about the English in their habit of thought, sleepy routine, and a tortoise's instinct to hold hard to the ground with his claws lest he should be thrown on his back. There's a drag of inertia which resists reform in every shape. And this is why, for Emerson, he's going to say that there are lots of English people that had serious qualms with America because they saw them as a little bit too progressive, too quickly wanting to progress. An Englishman shows no mercy to those below him in the social scale, as he looks for none from those above him. Any forbearance from his superiors surprises him, and they suffer in his good opinion. Fundamentally, one of the differences between American democratic thinking and this idea of the English and their love of elitism, we might say. Chapter 19 is a speech, and it begins this way. It's called Speech at Manchester. A few days after my arrival at Manchester in November 1847, the Manchester Athenaeum gave its annual banquet in the Free Trade Hall. With other guests, I was invited to be present and to address the company. In looking over recently a newspaper report of my remarks, I inclined to reprint it as fitly expressing the feeling which I entered England, and which agrees well enough with the more deliberate results of better acquaintance recorded in the foregoing pages. So here you have the American Emerson standing in front of a bunch of English people, and he is going to tell them what he thinks of their country. I just want to quote some lines out of this to finish this lecture. He says about England, "It is not true, sir, that the wise ancients did not praise the ship parting with flying colors from the port, but only that brave sailor which came back with torn sheets and battered sides, stripped of her banners, but having ridden out the storm." I pause for a moment to just think about Whitman's "Oh Captain, my Captain," and the word picture of the ship that's come back in after all busted up. And so, gentlemen, he's going to applaud the English. And so, gentlemen, I feel in regards to this aged England, with the possessions, honors, and trophies, and also with the infirmities of 1,000 years gathering around her, irrevotably committed as she now is to many old customs which cannot be suddenly changed, pressed upon by the transitions of trade and new and all incalculable modes, fabrics, arts, machines, and competing populations, I see her not dispirited, not weak — this will sound like Tennyson's Ulysses, but well remembering that she has seen dark days before, indeed, with a kind of instinct that she sees a little better in a cloudy day, and in that storm of battle and calamity, she has a secret vigor and a pulse like a cannon. I see her in her old age, not decrepit, but young, and still daring to believe in her power of endurance and expansion. Seeing this, I say, all hail, Mother of Nations, Mother of Heroes. Well, this is fun stuff, the way that Emerson will finish his tribute to England and to the English people in this speech. Well, let's quickly finish. At level 2A, messages, themes. Obviously, one is, Emerson's going to argue that England deserves Americans' respect. Also, that England is conservative while America is clearly progressive. It's one of the arguments he'll be making throughout this text. And then finally, that he sees it coming on the horizon, that soon America will somehow transcend England. And we think, of course, of the Second World War as just a classic example, how America, those Yankee soldiers had to arrive to begin the process of helping to end that war. At level 2B in the rhetoric, well, this is a different kind of writing than the other kind of essays. Let's just point that out that we've been reading. Note his love of lists, right, and especially that Shakespeare and Milton constantly will be in those lists. Note the personal tone. It's clear that Emerson wants to please his English readers while informing his American readers all at the same time. And he walks a really fine line. And to that degree, that makes this a really interesting read. At level 3A, our relationship to other texts into the world. Well, we think about all kinds of travel books, don't we? I mean, everything from Marco Polo to Tocqueville's Democracy in America and everything in between. What is for you your favorite kind of text like that? What's your favorite movie about culture contact when cultures collide and Americans are traveling, for example, in other parts of the world? And what is your favorite text about travel as well? Emerson makes the point that while he's traveling, he liked to be able to mark his travelings through the books that he was reading. That's a fascinating question. If you're going to travel somewhere, what's the book that you would best serve you to travel with? Finally, at 3B, how do we relate this kind of information to ourselves? Well, I think that this is this text, while it's outdated, it still does raise a couple of questions for us. What do you think? Are cultures today more similar, or are they much more different? Because we are, as they say, a shrinking world because of our technologies. Do you think like we have a better understanding of other cultures and they have a better understanding of our American culture, or has it gotten actually worse? How about you? Where do you want to travel? For Emerson, it was the traveling in Europe. Where would you like to travel? Make that list and maybe someday try and meet some of those countries on your list. And what about the study of cultures? Why do it at all? Like, what is the point of all the culture contact? Many have argued that our study of foreign languages are important for that very reason, because we can begin to respect the fact we live on a planet with lots and lots of other people and also lots of other cultures. Well, this ends our Volume 5 study of the Harvard Classics. I do want to turn, though, before I leave, actually, my series of comments with Emerson. There's several texts that I think, while not included in the Harvard Classics Volume 5, I feel like we need to work with. Our high school in our junior year has a text of Emerson that has several titles that are not in Harvard Classics Volume 5, and I want to talk about those, beginning with that classic essay, book-length essay called Nature from 1836. In many ways, the beginning of everything Emersonian will happen, at least in writing there. Let's spend a few moments with that one in our next conversation. Thank you.